On behalf of the AFT and Share My Lesson, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Megan Artmeyer. I'm an associate in the Ed Issues Department at the AFT, and I will be your moderator. I'd like to introduce our presenters, Pasha Dashtgard, Director of Research Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab at American University, and Otis McGresham. He is the Assistant Director for Prevention at the Vanderbilt University Project Safe Center, and he is on the board of Stop Sexual Assault in Schools, a nonprofit. You can read their bios by opening the speaker widget on the bottom of your screen. Now I'll turn it over to our presenters. Thank you for joining us today and welcome.
Otis, I think you need to turn your microphone on.
There we go. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to everybody for joining us for your professional development this afternoon. We are going to touch on, hopefully is a very real topic and something that's impacting classrooms all across the country, and we'll be able to leave with a little bit of guidance or some suggestions on how we might do this effectively going forward. So, like we said, there's some bio stuff. Here's a little bit about me. If you think about kind of how I got to the point where I'm sitting in front of you talking about misogyny in grade 6 through 12, been working in higher education since 2003, really focusing on those educational environments, focusing on what does it look like to create opportunities for folks to learn and grow and engage in real conversations among themselves and among other students.
Hi, everybody. My name is Pasha Dashtgard. Yes, so thank you so much. I'm very excited to talk about this very important and very relevant topic, unfortunately. So I have a PhD in social psychology. I did my dissertation research on male supremacy and online radicalization. Before that, I was a mental health counselor for many years. I got my mental health counseling degree from Columbia University, and I've sort of spanned all from 10-year-olds as a school counselor all the way up to full adult schizophrenics. I've done substance abuse counseling. I've studied PTSD and large-scale mental health service delivery. So really excited to be here today.
Beautiful. So our plan for today is to really give you some important definitions and some language to use. When we start talking about misogyny and some of the issues that we're going to talk about, lots of these terms and phrases are familiar, but we haven't really thought about what does it actually mean? What does that look like? What are some examples that I can pull from my lived experience, from my classroom, from the spaces that I'm in to help me identify what I'm looking at and then how I can intervene? So that's going to be a big chunk on the front end, is understanding what these terms are. And then we're really going to start looking at different strategies that you as an educator can use, whether you're in the classroom as a teacher and you're leading that specific educational environment, or you're a school administrator kind of responsible for an entire school setting. We'll talk about some strategies that you can use in either of those positions, and we'll dive into some peer education strategies that we can use to combating some of these incidences of misogyny as well. And then finally, we'll give you some resources. We've got some really good resources that are free, relatively easy to use, that you can bring back to your communities and hopefully have some of these conversations that are going to push this education just a little bit further.
Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to learn some definitions. We're teachers, we're academics, this is what we do. We got to define our terms so that we know what we're talking about here. So the definitions we're going to go over are patriarchy, masculinity, misogyny, and the manosphere. So patriarchy, when we talk about patriarchy, it's in sociology, we talk about it as a form of social organization where cultural and institutional beliefs and values are dominated by men. I prefer to think of this as like a place. Patriarchy is like a gendered system of social relations between men and women that elevate some men to positions of power and authority and keep women from positions of power and authority. Masculinity, when we talk about this, what we're talking about is a social construct that refers to the behaviors, characteristics, and expectations associated with men. misogyny is the hatred of, aversion to, or prejudice against women and girls. I also like Kate Mann's definition of this in Down Girl. She talks about misogyny as like the policing, harassment, intimidation, and physical violence that are met to women and girls that step outside of the patriarchal social order. So the idea is that if you act opposed to the patriarchy, you're going to be punished. And misogyny is the sort of act of policing that gendered system of social relations. And then the manosphere. I hope you don't know what the manosphere is. I would love for you to not have heard of the manosphere. It's a collection of websites, blogs, and online forums that promotes a version of masculinity that is deeply misogynistic and anti-feminist. It is a sort of loose collection of sites, platforms, and apps that all sort of have the ideology of male supremacy that kind of connects them all together. Okay, so we're going to watch a video now by an intern at the Stop Sexual Assault in Schools club. Let's see. Let's see. Hopefully it goes soon. Okay.
You're at a party and overhear Miles and Jay commenting on Angela's outfit. She's asking for trouble dressing slutty. Yeah, she's such a hoe. They're normalizing treating Angela like a sexual object, dehumanizing her. Objectifying and dehumanizing people create an environment known as rape culture, where sexual violence is considered normal and excused. People who hear Miles and Jake may think that those two are okay with degrading and harassing girls. When they act like this, Miles and Jake contribute to rape culture and harm themselves and others. They probably don't even know why they think this way about girls, women, or genderqueer people. Sexist comments and jokes influence how people act toward girls and reinforce rape culture. When you hear such comments or see harassing behaviors, speak up. Guys, learn about healthy masculinity and do your part to call out sexism and misogyny. Find out more in our Powered Topics and start a Sash Club.
Okay, so have you seen examples of misogyny in your school? This is what the poll is sort of assessing here.
Yeah, we've got some great academic definitions to give you a sense of the terms that we're going to be using, but we really want you to think about your school setting. So the video just gave us some great lived examples of how misogyny or those kind of harmful ideas of masculinity might kind of impact your classroom. Thinking through, what does it look like when you're working with your students? What does it look like when your students are interacting with you? What are some of the attitudes, behaviors, and cultures that you're seeing exhibited within your school that might live up to some of these definitions of masculinity? Maybe, unfortunately, you might be exposed to the manosphere in your classroom. So you've got people talking about blogs or websites or TikToks that they follow and kind of sharing those kinds of things. So I've got 4 options. Like, yes, I've seen examples of misogyny in my classroom or school. B, I have heard of examples in my classroom or school. C, I've both seen and heard examples of misogyny in my classrooms or school. And then D, I've neither seen nor heard examples of misogyny in my classroom or school. So let's see what our poll says. I'm hoping that if there's a whole lot of Ds, unfortunately, that's only about 4% of us. It feels like about a little better than half of us have both seen and heard examples of what we're talking about today in your classrooms or your schools. Most of us, 96% of us, have either seen or heard or seen and heard. So this is not something new. This is not something that we have to convince you exists. Really, it's about how do we give you tools, how do we give you strategies to address some of these problems that we're seeing in our classrooms. So that is the unfortunate reality that we're dealing with. I appreciate your participation in the poll, and hopefully by the end of this hour today, you'll leave with just a few more tools in your tool belt to address some of that problematic behavior.
So one thing that I want to talk about before we really dive into the male supremacy and the misogyny aspect of it, there's another aspect of this, which is online radicalization and the way that these misogynistic ideas and this male supremacist content is coming into your classroom, coming to your students through smartphones, through laptops, through social media platforms. And so the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of ease, accessibility, and addiction. So we're all kind of hopelessly addicted to our phones. This is not an accident. This is how they designed them. They are meant to be addictive. And this is unique. We're in a unique situation in that people are now able to communicate with each other in these niche online forums in ways that have never really happened before in human history. We are able to connect even really marginalized, really fringe extremist groups are able to find huge communities, hundreds, if not thousands of people across the globe. And they're able to connect on whatever topic, whether it's the earth being flat, whether birds aren't real, or whether, in the case of Andrew Tate and male supremacist ideology, women are inherently inferior to men. And so it's so easy for young people to get access to these things. If you go on YouTube right now and you type in how to get a girlfriend, the first thing you're going to see is male supremacist pseudoscience about dating and relationships. The next piece of this is that this isn't even an accidental thing. The algorithms target particularly young boys, feeding them this kind of male supremacist content. And so this is, even if they were not looking for it, it's coming to them. And then once you click on a video, your feed is going to be populated with more and more videos that are just like that. And what this does is it creates these sort of filter bubbles, is what we call them, these kind of echo chambers, where ideas that are very fringe and in some cases extremely offensive, they are so commonly seen in your algorithm, they're populating your social media feeds, they're being forced onto you in a way that makes you feel like, oh, this idea must be much more popular than it actually is. That there is this sort of distortion in how we understand what normal people are seeing or what most people think. And so especially for young people, they're being given these messages and being shown this content that kind of creates an illusion that people are much more comfortable with and endorsing these male supremacist ideas, when in fact they're very fringe and not that many people really believe these things. This concept of a soapbox community, what I mean by that is these forums, especially the like red pill forums, these incel forums, they offer young people an opportunity to rant and tell the world how it is. And you can imagine, for people who feel disempowered, for people who feel marginalized or ignored or cast aside, or they're being told through their social media feeds and their influencers that the world has forgotten about them or the world doesn't care about them anymore. There's something very powerful about giving young people an opportunity to tell their truth and to sit on their soapbox and rant at the stars. And these communities, they prey on that idea by opening up these forums and giving the illusion of like, oh, well, we're welcoming everyone, when in fact they're highly policing the kind of content that is allowed on these forums, that is allowed in these conversations. And they really moderate them to push them into toxicity. They don't allow you, for example, in incel forums, you're not allowed to tell people, hey, it's going to be okay. You're not allowed to tell people you actually are attractive, you don't have to worry about it. You're not allowed to tell people that it's going to get better for you. They explicitly ban those comments and remove those comments, so that what's left is this kind of toxic pity party where people really just stew in their own resentment and their own grievance. And these soapbox communities give people a kind of opportunity to really live and sort of like bathe in that toxic resentment. And it's only stoked by the rest of the community members. And finally, this idea of bridges that can't bear the weight. So this is an idea that comes to me from my therapy background. it's very well understood in therapy that the rapport between a client and a counselor, or a client and a counselor, that is the determinant of the success of a therapeutic relationship. So you can predict the success of a therapeutic relationship within the first 20 minutes based on how warmly the client and the counselor feel towards one another. In online forums and online discourse, we don't get that. It's anonymous. It's disembodied. You don't even know if the person you're talking to is a real person, or if they're a bot, or if they're a troll, or if they're intentionally trying to egg you on. And so when we're having these very intense conversations about gender and sex and sexuality and what is fair and what is just and what do I deserve, we're having these conversations in ways that don't facilitate genuine human connection. And thus, I think about it like a bridge that can hold the weight of the heaviness of the conversations that we're having. If you're having these conversations with anonymous avatars, you're never going to be able to have that good faith argumentation, that kind of like spirit of cooperation that you need in order to talk about gender and sex and dating culture and, online dating apps and all of that. So these are these elements that make it so that the kids that are coming into your classrooms, they're already at a disadvantage. They're already having their social lives dictated by online mediums that are not there to facilitate healthy and cooperative conversations. They're there to egg on grievance and disdain and resentment. So one question is like, how is this new? Isn't this just like misogyny? Isn't this just how it's been for a very long time? And I think there's a term called hegemonic masculinity it's a very fancy, academic term, but really what we're talking about is the ideal masculine role. And what has changed in recent times is that rather than this sort of like, leave it to Beaver, head of the household, husband, father, white picket fence, 2.5 kids, that kind of vision of masculinity, that used to be the vision of the hegemonic masculine ideal. Now it's the Bachelor. Now there's this real aversion to marriage and relationships, like long-term committed monogamous relationships, such that the goal is to bed as many women as possible, frankly, if you're a boy or a man. And that is the ultimate validation of your masculinity. That is the ultimate, kind of the only important thing to determine your male masculine status. And so they use all of this pseudoscience, this biological determinism. They'll talk about testosterone. They'll talk about, with women, like, during ovulation, your attraction is to alpha males, and all of this like pseudoscience. But it's couched in these terms and this language that lends itself to an air of authority. And so it's very different insofar as it is not as concerned with like homophobia in the sense that if you're still displaying hypermasculine traits, who you are betting is actually not as important as that you are maintaining this sort of like hegemonic masculine ideal. And so it is, these websites, platforms, and apps are not just displaying this toxic content, but they are actually shaping the narratives and the conversations and sort of incentivizing this grievance-based communication. So one thing that I'm frequently asked is like, what are we aiming towards then? Okay, fine. Male supremacy is bad. Toxic masculinity is bad. We can all agree on that. But what is the positive version of this? And often people are looking for a term. They want healthy masculinity or expansive masculinity or transcendent masculinity. And I appreciate all of those people, and I appreciate all of those things. I read all of those articles. But for me, the way that I think about this is it's masculinities, multiple ways of being a man. That for the boys in your class, especially, who are struggling with like, okay, I understand that feminism has uncovered these systemic gender differences, and there is like power dynamics that mean that men are elevated unfairly, but like, what am I supposed to be then? And I think that the answer for me is that you don't need to choose between different parts of yourself. That one of the sort of hallmarks of hegemonic masculinity and male supremacy is like killing parts of yourself in order to fit into what we call like the man box. This very small, very rigid way in which you can be a man, which you can be a person, right? You don't even get to be a full person. You only get to be a man. You get to have two emotions, anger and lust, and that's kind of it. You're not allowed to express needs. You're not allowed to seek out help. And so rather than trying to make young men choose between riding horses and writing poetry, reading poetry, you can do both of these things. You don't have to choose. You can be your full self. And you can invite young people, especially young men, to be their full selves and not have to make these impossible decisions between honoring your hegemonic masculine ideal and being a full human.
So then the question becomes, how do we do that, right? So you are leading the classroom. We're seeing these instances of misogyny. We're seeing this harm in our learning environments. What are some skills or tools that we can give you to help you address that in real time? This is what we're going to do. We've broken it down into 3 specific areas. First, we're going to talk about intervention strategies for teachers and counselors and coaches. So folks who are working directly with our students who are experiencing or kind of carrying out these types of behaviors. We're going to talk about intervention strategies for administrators who are overseeing teachers, counselors, and coaches who are doing the work with individual students. And then we'll talk about those peer education strategies. So how do we get students to have conversations among themselves to address some of this behavior as well? So when we start talking about intervention strategies for you as a teacher, this really comes from my work in prevention education, really thinking about how do we care for people and get at the heart of what people's concerns are. So how do we address what the actual issue is? And we can give you the 3 R's. So if it's easier to remember, hopefully that's something that you can use on a regular basis. And that's going to be recognize, respond, and reframe. When we start talking about recognizing behavior, that's why we started with the definitions. That's why we started with that video, to kind of give you examples of what you might be seeing, or getting you to think about what are the behaviors that manifest that are problematic that I want to address. If we can recognize that behavior and label it appropriately, one of the things that we want to do is to be able to not only recognize the behavior that's been in the classroom, but some of the underlying exposures that might have led to that behavior. So is this student participating in the manosphere? Is this student repeating something they heard on the nightly news last night, or repeating something they heard from someone from their family or social circle? Where does that come from? What perspective are they bringing to the space? Recognize all of that. So if we just focus on the harm, we're going to miss a lot of the underlying things that are supporting that harm, and it's going to make our intervention a lot less effective. If we can seek to understand where they're coming from, we don't want to normalize, we don't want to make excuses for any problematic behavior, or we don't want to dismiss or justify any behavior. But if we can understand you're doing XYZ because you've seen XYZ parroted on your social media, in your TikTok, in your social circle, in your friend group, in your family, that gives us an idea that our intervention doesn't just need to be about this moment. Our intervention needs to be about the culture and the community that you're existing in. So that recognition is more than just what's happening in our classrooms, but recognizing what's supporting that behavior in our classrooms as well. Once we recognize, we want to respond effectively. So even though we are focusing on understanding what's supporting that harmful behavior, our response truly needs to be about maintaining that educational environment that we are responsible for. So whether we talk about social emotional learning, whether we talk about teaching people how to be friends and how to use our words and not use our violence and not impact people negatively, all of those pieces are part of what we do as teachers, part of what we do as leaders in the classroom. One of the ways that we can respond effectively is we can highlight the impact. So if I am merely parroting something that I saw on TV, and you as my teacher can highlight the impact that I had on my classmate, that is a way to personalize and ground, like what I just said had a negative impact. Am I a negative person? Do I want that to be my identity and how I want people to see me? If not, I need to change my behavior. So if we can highlight that impact, that's got to be our first kind of like, here's a way that we can respond in a way that's like, hey, do you realize that you've altered the entire vibe for this room? Like, you have altered everybody else's learning experience because of the thing that you just said, or the way that you just interacted, or what you brought into this learning space. One of the things that impresses me amazingly about teachers, especially like middle school, elementary school, even all the way to high school, are the systems and practices that you can normalize. So I have a freshman in high school, and all the way through middle school, the way that you can bring a classroom's attention. So 1, 2, 3, eyes on me, it works. And I had a middle school teacher who her whole thing was the Red Robin. It's like she'd say Red Robin, and the entire class would say yum. Having never been to Red Robin, my daughter bought into it immediately. The systems that you put in place, if we can recognize and highlight impact and use those systems intentionally to correct some of that behavior, to create that learning environment, whether that be the creative use of grabbing the classroom's attention, a creative use of helping people understand that their words or their actions have had a negative impact, those systems that we have put in place for our class, how do we leverage those to make sure that they're a part of our response as well? And I don't expect you to go into a full restorative justice circle in your classroom, but we do want to focus on healing the harm that's been happening. So rather than have all of our attention directed to the person who's causing the harm, have all of our attention directed to correcting behavior that's negative, we also want to attend to the people who have been harmed. So how do we care for those students who have experienced harmful words or harmful language or harmful behaviors, to let them know that you are still cared for in this space? You are still a valued member of our community, and this community is going to respond to the harm that you've experienced in the way that we're going to care for you and try to heal that harm as best as we can. And then the last R, as we move past that response piece, is to reframe. So Pasha gave you a great example and kind of great talking points around what that manosphere looks like and how that community is really created around you. This is your opportunity as a leader in the classroom, your opportunity as a teacher to reframe that experience, to provide that counter narrative where what you just parroted back isn't appropriate. Here's some other ways for us to intervene or interact as a community. Here's some other ways for us to show our appreciation for other people. Here's some other ways for us to communicate effectively. If we can reframe and provide that counter narrative, that's going to be one voice, one trusted adult that we can see that student can lay their eyes on and be like, okay, here's another way of being. Here's a message that tells me that what I'm seeing in TikTok, what I'm seeing in Snapchat, what I'm seeing in Instagram, what I'm seeing wherever it comes from, doesn't really resonate with the culture and the community and the role that I want to play in my community. So that counter narrative is pretty impactful and extremely important for us to lean into. When we create space for belonging, that is often what the manosphere does. That echo chamber and that soapbox community that Pasha talked about, that's a space where I can share whatever frustrations that I've had, whatever experience I've had. And even though it's negative, I get to have that off my chest, and I get to feel that someone else believes me and someone else is believing in my experience. You can create that space for belonging in your classroom. You can create that positive space for belonging where that entire student gets to come in. And are you lonely? Yes, let's talk about loneliness, and let's talk about how that impacts our ability to connect with other people. Let's talk about our unwanted experiences that we've had. Let's talk about how we communicate with other people. Let's talk about all of these things and create a space where those conversations, that type of education is happening. Because when you can do this and you can align that student's development with your institutional values, the things that are set forth in that school, what's a part of that learning environment, you create a space for that student to then practice and learn. I want to be a responsible citizen in the future. How do I practice that today? So I can't practice misogyny. I can't practice homophobia. I can't practice racism or sexism and be the productive member of society that I want to be, even if that's what's reflected back to me in the manosphere. What are some different ways that I can manifest those things and have that? So that 3R piece. So really trying to recognize that behavior, trying to respond effectively, and then trying to reframe to provide some of those counter narratives are going to be important for us as intervention strategies in the classroom. Here's our second poll question, and really it's designed to gauge how realistic would the 3 R's be for you. So, do you feel supported responding to incidences of misogyny in your classroom or school? First option is I feel confident in my ability to respond and I feel supported by my administration. Second option, I feel confident in my ability to respond, but not supported by my administration. Third, I feel confident in my ability to respond, but supported by I don't feel confident in my ability to respond, but supported by my administration. And then fourth, finally, I don't feel confident in my ability to respond or supported by my administration. So this is just to get a feel for what your lived experience is and how realistic those 3 R's might be in addressing some of the misogynistic behaviors that you're seeing in your classrooms. And it looks like we've got 41 and 39, that's 80% of us feel confident in our ability to respond. And then we've got some differences in our administrative support going forward. But that's a lion's share of us that we can take these tools and apply that to our classrooms and hopefully create those learning environments that are going to be supportive and not have the negative impacts of that misogyny in the classroom. So hopefully it's going to give us a tool that we can work with. The second part, when we start thinking about what does it look like for administrators, so folks who are over school systems, folks who are over teachers, to make sure that we are kind of driving in and have some resources and tools to use as well, because that's going to be important. If our teachers feel confident in the classroom, but administrators, they don't have confidence that whatever they do in the classroom is going to be supported or going to be backed up. If a parent calls or a parent complains, we have to figure out what that looks like as well. So the entire school system becomes that counter narrative. The entire school system becomes part of how we interact and how we prevent some of this behavior from happening as well.
Okay, so one of the things that we talk about a lot in both higher education and in K-12 spaces is that, there's this constant debate about free speech versus hate speech. And this is a no-win argument. Like, don't have this argument. Instead, you can actually lean into your school's mission and values. Those aren't just posters on the wall. They actually can be a useful tool when you're having a conversation with a student or a parent or an administrator about why it is that you are pushing back, why it is that you're responding and reframing these kind of misogynistic statements. So you don't have to have the argument about whether it is technically legal for you to say something horrifically misogynistic in the classroom. That's not the point. The point is that's not the value that we have in this classroom. That's not the kind of school community, that's not the kind of learning community that we want here. And so we're not going to tolerate that kind of behavior. We are going to facilitate and foster a better kind of environment. Some really brilliant professor named Otis McGresham said once to me that your classroom is not supposed to reflect the reality of the world. It is supposed to be an aspirational place where you can create the kind of community that you hope to see in the outside world. I think that's beautiful, and I think that is exactly right. So when you have mission statements and value statements in your classroom at your school, you can just point to them, and that can be the way that you center the conversations that you're about to have.
One of the things that we need to be able to think about is, as an administrator, kind of like the first R was that recognize you need to be on the lookout for these behaviors in your schools. You need to be on the lookout for ways in which you can support your teachers and the coaches and the counselors that are in your schools interacting with students. Because misogynistic behavior isn't just student to student. It's not just peer to peer. Your staff, your teachers are experiencing that behavior as well. So take those clues seriously. If a teacher is talking to you about a situation they've had in their classroom or a situation they've had with a student or an environment that's developing within the community, don't wait for the explosive event where something significant has to happen. Recognize that whatever that misogynistic behavior is, it's grading against the mission and the values and kind of the learning community that you're trying to have in your school. If we take those smaller things seriously, if we don't allow that foundational behavior to happen, it's much less likely that those more egregious instances of harm are going to happen as well. The role for you as an administrator is to understand your community. understand what it looks like, understand what it feels like, understand as we integrate new classes every year, as we reflect the community that's around us, what are we kind of pushing up against? So if we think about all of the things that Pasha kind of laid out in terms of the manosphere, what direct impacts are impacting your community? Are there things that are going to really talk about from a social media standpoint, that's really impacting my community? Or maybe it's really from a socioeconomic standpoint, or from an immigration standpoint, from an ethnicity standpoint. What things are impacting, what cultures are impacting your community, so that you can attend to those and make sure that we're being culturally relevant and what our interventions are, and we're supporting the staff that we need to in the ways that we need to, so that they can support our students. And then finally, as an administrator, we don't want to shy away from these conversations. If we shy away from the misogynistic behavior, if we shy away from the harmful content that our students are bringing into our classrooms, we're robbing ourselves of that intervention. We're robbing ourselves of that opportunity to provide them with the counter narrative, to provide them with that deeper learning, to figure out, this is what you said, or this is what you did. This is the impact that what you said or what you did had, and then here's the consequences of those behaviors. If we can help them link action to consequences effectively by promoting that conversation, we are educating that student and how they operate within our community. As an administrator, if we are too hesitant to have the conversation, if we are uncomfortable having the conversation, it robs our opportunity to support our teachers, and it robs our students of the opportunity to learn from their mistakes, learn from their missteps, learn from the community that we've created so that they can learn. We're taking that away from them. So we have to look for these behaviors and lean into our role as an administrator to support our staff in addressing these behaviors.
So one thing that we can do here is that you can review your policies and your protocols with your administrators right now. If you are worried, we saw, 40% of our attendees feel like their administration is not going to be supportive of them. So this is the moment to have the conversation proactively. Rather than wait for some crisis to occur, have the conversation about, like, what would we do if something happens? What would we say if a parent comes in and yells at me for correcting a misogynistic statement that their student made? This is actually a very important way to gauge and sort of game plan with your administration. What is our policy here? I can tell you, we field 2-3 emails a week from administrators and teachers and parents that are dealing with this kind of misogynistic behavior in the classroom, and they have no idea what to do. This is the first time that they ever even thought about, what should I be doing in response to this kind of thing? So here we are. This is the webinar. Go now. Think through, what is your policy for your classroom, and also, can you game plan with your principal and your vice principal and your dean of students? What is the next step in case that does happen?
One thing that we know to be true is that in this current reality, I would love to let you know that you can lean into federal guidelines or state guidelines or rules or regulations. I do not know that that is going to be the reality for all of us. What I do know is that these behaviors, when we start talking about harassing behaviors, we start talking about these gender-based behaviors, they are prohibited by federal legislation. Like, they are illegal. They aren't acceptable. And we may or may not have a Department of Education to enforce the laws that are holding these things together. So we need to think about, what does it look like in your district? What does it look like in your state? What does it look like for you to lean into, whether there are legal pieces? Because as an administrator, you have to be aware of how your school sits and how your school would be supported to make sure that your decisions in your school are going to be in alignment with those laws and regulations that are going to be in place. As of right now, Title IX is still the law of the land. Title IX is still the law that will prohibit these harassing behaviors from happening, and you can lean into Title IX. Given the reality of your political climate wherever you are, that may or may not shift, that may or may not change. So just keep your thumb on the pulse, be aware of what that looks like or what that feels like in your district is going to be important. When we think about what it looks like to identify allies and identify folks who are going to support us, if we can familiarize ourselves with our local community, so kind of getting back to what environment is our school existing in, regardless of where the state law protections land, regardless of where district policies land, regardless of where federal legislation lands, if you can find allies within your PTA, allies on your local school board, allies within your community, we can still work with the protections that we have and make sure that they're going to be reflective and responsive enough for the communities that we're trying to create. So we have to increasingly rely on our community, increasingly rely on the folks that are around us, because we don't necessarily know what the actual legislation is going to be or how that legislation is going to be enforced. But trust and believe that if we're talking about safety in schools, if we're talking about keeping students safe, if we're talking about creating learning environments where students aren't going to experience harm, there are allies among us. How do we lean into those allies and lean into the people that are going to help support us create the environments that we're trying to maintain?
And one thing that, I mean, it bears repeating just because we're in a political moment where it bears repeating. But the reason that we do this, the reason that we stand up and respond in moments where somebody says something that is misogynistic or racist or homophobic is because your students need a safe learning environment in order to learn. This is like science. You cannot learn if you are under threat. And so what you are tasked with doing, and this is a hard thing to do, is you have to have a level of self-awareness to recognize when a statement is violating someone in your classroom's sense of personal well-being or safety or comfort. And it's difficult because everything in our environment is telling us this is not a big deal, it's just a joke, it's just they're just kids, they don't even know what they're saying. And it's like that, all of that is the like counterforce to you, the teacher, setting a standard for your classroom and saying, no, this is not a place where that kind of thing is going to happen. No, this is not a situation where a student is going to feel unsupported because of something that was said by another student. So this is the way in which you have to sort of recognize your own biases and be able to say like, yep, that actually, even if it's not targeting me, this is something that I think somebody in my classroom would not appreciate. We are waiting on her there.
There we go.
Sasha hurries, getting her stuff together at her locker, trying to avoid Nick between classes. But just as she's adjusting the lock, Sasha feels it. Nick has snapped her bra strap again. He cackles. Sasha hides her irritation as she walks to class. The bra snapping has already happened several times. Sasha is unsure about reporting these incidents. Any type of unwanted touching, whether it's a hug or pulling a girl's bra, is sexual harassment. There are many kinds of sexual harassment, but none should be allowed in schools. When the adults fail to protect students, it can have lasting effects on both the victim and the harasser. Ignoring sexual harassment sends a message that it's acceptable to treat students this way. Find out about the many kinds of sexual harassment and what you can do about it in our power topic, Sexual Harassment Defined and its Impact on Students.
Okay.
There we go. So we've got some peer education pieces that are great opportunities when we can get students to talk to each other. So if we can have students to student share, this is the impact that you're having, and this is the culture and community that I'm trying to create, that buy-in can oftentimes be just a difference maker in terms of like students' ability to recognize harm, and we're instilling leadership and some change makers along the way. We're going to talk about a few. One is going to be SASH clubs through Stop Sexual Assault in Schools. We're going to talk about Girls Learn International and the GET project as well. SASH Club, if you go back into the Share My Lesson from this past summer, I did a workshop on SASH clubs that went through how to use them, how to access them, what they look like. So that's going to go in depth as to what these clubs look like, how you might get one started, how you might reach out for some support. That's going to be linked in our resources as well. But generally, our Stop Sexual Assault in Schools has created SASH clubs, or created the opportunity for students to create SASH clubs within their schools. It's going to be a student organization where we provide lots of content that we've collaborated with different organizations from all across the country to figure out what are some topics that students might be interested in, and then we give them guided resources and materials as to how they navigate their clubs. The beautiful part about a SASH club, or why SASH clubs are valuable, is it's a safe place for students to learn and practice what that leadership looks like. So kind of the antithesis of those echo chambers, or kind of when we started talking about the manosphere and kind of that soapbox community, the SASH club is an opportunity for people to share their experiences of harm, share their experiences of the change that they want to initiate, share their experiences of the community that they want to lead, and then they're supported by people who share that same vision. So we're creating an echo chamber where those positive ideals are going to be reflected back to students, and there's going to be opportunities for folks to share their opinions, share their experiences, and broaden the approach or broaden the impact based upon all of the identities of the people that make up the club. SASH clubs benefit students, they benefit schools, and benefit communities as a whole. Students thrive when they can understand the world around them. That's a large part of what student learning is how do I understand my impact on the world, or the world's impact on me? SASH Club gives you a group of like-minded folks to help navigate that conversation, to recognize that not every interaction in school is going to be positive, and how do we create a space where we're going to push back on some of those negative pieces and make those positive pieces much more likely to occur. SASH Clubs offers power topics, and this is going to be the toolkits that we provide students. The newest one is going to be on misogyny and male supremacy. That is linked in this professional development session here, so you can walk through that power topic. It's basically a PowerPoint slide that walks you through, here's some discussion prompts, here's some things to think about, here's some resources to look into, here are some ways that you can reach out for support from your academic advisor, from your teachers, your school administrators, and it walks you through different topics that might be of interest to folks that are in the SASH Club. So really thinking through what does that look like, and not having to recreate the wheel, not having to search for all of these resources and piece it all together. The Stop Sexual Assault in Schools SASH Club website gives you these power topics for you to go ahead and use within your clubs to make that change.
It's so cool. The SASH Club is so cool. I'm in awe. So one of the things that the power topic is based off of is It's Not Just a Joke guide. This is a guide, not just a joke, preventing sexuality and gender-based violence, or gender-based bigotry. This was written in collaboration with my organization, PERIL, and the Southern Poverty Law Center. And it is an incredible guide that sort of takes you through what is male supremacy, how is it related to racism, how is it related to transphobia, how is it related to, all sorts of supremacist ideologies. And then also, what can you do? What are strategies that you can use to have these conversations and have them be productive and not just devolve into defensiveness?
So we would be remiss if only thing we told you about were things that Stop Sexual Assault in Schools provides. So Girls Learn International is another nonprofit organization that offers similar student groups or student organizations within a school, where it really focuses on helping people take leadership and take action on gender equity or human rights issues, and really talk about equitable access to education. So we start talking about the impacts of misogyny in schools. This is another great opportunity where you can just start a chapter in your school and have that peer-to-peer conversation as to what does change making look like? What does it look like to create a positive environment or positive school environment where we're going to be taking action on a regular basis to address some of these behaviors? It's really all across the country. There's 165 different chapters, and it's a really free social movement or social change movement that you can bring into your school system. Another perk that you can bring into the school is the gender equity training. Now, this would be more along the lines of something that you would facilitating to a classroom. There is an education part, there's a pre and post test, but it's really about raising people's academic kind of knowledge around what gender equity looks like, what some of those strains are, what some of those pressures are, what are some of the ways that we can address those behaviors that impact gender equity negatively, what are some ways that we can promote positive behaviors that are going to improve gender equity. The GET project curriculum is free, and it's something that you can work into your social emotional learning within your classroom as well. One of the cool things is when you look at the results. So anytime you start talking about educational curriculum and teaching students content, we want to be able to measure what are they getting out of it. When we start looking at the GET curriculum, we are absolutely seeing benefits in terms of a student's ability to talk about, to recognize, to work to improve their knowledge, their awareness around gender equity and issues that are going to either positively or negatively impact gender equity, and their role to make a difference in promoting gender equity. We want to give you a quick, as we're wrapping up today, an overview of the resources that are going to be listed in this webinar that's going to live on the internet, so that you can come back to them as often or as much as you like. First thing I want you to think about is what already exists in your schools. So many schools and school systems are already using bystander intervention models. Things that are generally geared toward bullying prevention are really kind of that culture change piece. Most of your bystander intervention models are really going to be about recognizing problematic behavior, developing skills to intervene in problematic behavior, and creating community where violence is less likely to occur. If we reframe that, remember we're reframing, we're thinking differently about this. Misogyny is a problematic behavior. If we've already invested time, effort, and energy to create a bystander intervention model for our school or our school system, how do we incorporate recognizing misogyny as one of those problematic behaviors that we're willing to intervene in? And we're already teaching our students the skills to intervene and have that positive impact. It's one thing that probably already exists in your school, and if it doesn't, it's something that's readily accessible.
So this is the Not Just a Joke guide that I was talking about earlier. I highly recommend. It's a free online resource. It is going to be tested. It is going to be disseminated in K-12 spaces. Please go with a lot of really smart people, truly like some of the most expert people in the country who are monitoring hate and extremism at the Southern Poverty Law Center, collaborated to create this guide. It is very good, in my humble opinion. Oh, sorry.
We've got one last poll as we round out, really thinking about resources. As we think about the resources that we just covered, the peer education resources, we're thinking about the GET curriculum, we're thinking about the GLI, we're thinking about SASH clubs. One option, all of these tools will be useful to me in my classroom or school. Second option, some of them will be useful to me in my classroom or school. Third option, I don't think I would be allowed to use these tools in my classroom or school. And then finally, none of these are a good fit for me or my classroom or school. So let's see where we sit there as we wind down. And it looks like beautiful. All of us think that some or all of these resources would be a good fit. That was the goal for our time today, was we could recognize and identify some of the problematic behaviors and then give you tools that you could use to address them. Here's some selected resources that are going to be hot linked with this as it's held on the internet. So you can go ahead and get back to this and click on that and get all these resources that hopefully it's something that's going to be useful for you. And then we've got contact information if you've got follow-up questions after this webinar. If there's more in-depth stuff that you wanted to talk about that we didn't have time to get into in our hour today, happy to answer those questions and field any of those questions after our time today.